Now, let's implement login in with Google. First, we need to create a Google OAuth client so we can get the needed client secret and client ID. So let's head over to the Google API console. We will go to the credentials page under APIs and services. Before we create the OAuth client, we will need to first set up the OAuth consent screen. I have already set up a demo that we'll use for this course. But basically what you need to do here is supply the name you want for the app and the scopes you want for the app. And because the app is set to testing, I have added a test user which I can use to test the app, pending when the application will be published to production. So those are the things to note. Once we've set up the OAuth consent screen, we can head back to the credentials page, then create credentials and select OAuth client ID. The application type is going to be web application, and I'm going to give it a name of demo. Then we'll add the redirect URL we have in the .env file, which is localhost 3333/login/google/callback. Then we can create it. The client has been created and we are presented with the credentials. So we're going to add them inside the .env file. So we can close this out. Without making any changes to the implementation we have, I will go ahead and log in with Google. I'm redirected to the consent screen. So I'll select my Google account, which is the one I added as the test user. I am logged in, but if you head over to the database and refresh, you'll notice there are no changes from what was there before. And that is because I am using the same email address for my GitHub and Google accounts. And remember in the code that we are checking that the email address doesn't exist yet. If it does, it will fetch the user that owns the email address. Otherwise, it will create the user. And since my Google email address matches the address I've used to log in with GitHub before, so it just fetched the user instead of creating a new one. So this is the potential issue I was talking about in the logging in with GitHub lesson. One way around this is to have an explicit check that checks against the email address and the provider. That way, if an email address already exists for a provider in the database, we can flash a kind of message and tell the user that, oh, you've already authenticated with this certain provider. Otherwise, we'll create the record as before. I have seen applications that does it this way, but I feel it's not optimal and kind of forces you to just one provider. But what we want is for users to be able to authenticate with any provider and not being confined to just one. So say if you log in with GitHub initially, then come back tomorrow and you want to log in with, say, Google, provided the email address matches, then you should be able to use any providers. So let's see how we're going to go about implementing that. We are going to create a dedicated table where we are going to store users' providers. So node is make model, and we're going to call the model user social, and we'll create a migration for it as well. Let's open the migration file and add the necessary fields. In addition to the ID, created at and updated at fields, we are going to add 3 more fields. That is the user ID field, which will link to the users table, then a field for the provider, and lastly a field for the provider ID, just as we have it in the users table. So table.integer, this should be user underscore ID. It's going to be unsigned and not nullable, and it's going to reference the ID colon on the users table. Then on delete, we'll cascade down. Then table.string provider, which will be not nullable, and the other one will be provider underscore ID, again, which will be not nullable. Now that we have a dedicated table to store the provider details, let's remove the provider details from the users table. And update the user model as well. I'm going to cut it since I'll be needing it inside the user social model. Then the user ID at column public user ID, which will be number. The user model and the user social model will have a one-to-many relationship, such that a user can authenticate with multiple social accounts, while a social account will belong to a particular user. So let's define the belongs to relationship here as belongs to user. The user model has been imported at the top. Then public user belongs to type of user. Then we'll define the inverse of the relationship in the user model as many user social. User social has been imported at the top. Public, we're going to call it socials, then as many type of user social. Before we make use of the relationship, let's not forget to migrate our database. So I'm going to refresh the database once again. Node is migration refresh. Now we can head over to the social auth controller. I'm going to get rid of this completely. What we need to do now is check if the user exists, and if the user has used the provider, await user.query.where email is equals to the email from the provider user.email. This will query the user's table for where the email from the provider exists in the database. We are also going to query the user socials table for where the provider ID and the provider matches. So .all whereas the all whereas method accepts two arguments. The first one is the relationship, which is socials, and a callback, which we can get the query from. Then we can query the user socials table using query.where provider equals the provider the user is trying to log in with, which you can get from params.provider. Then we'll also check where the provider underscore ID matches the ID on the user provider user.id. Then lastly, we will get the first match. I'm going to save to reformat. Let me explain what this query does once again. It will fetch a user that matches this email address, then further query the user's socials and where the provider ID matches that from the provider. So this should be provider user.id. Let's save it in a variable. Now we're going to perform a check if not user, that is, the user with the email address does not exist in the database, or the user have not logged in with the current provider before. So in that case, we will create a new record for the user in the database. So await user.create. Name will be provider user.name, and email will be provider user.email. Let's assign it to the user variable. At this point, we have a user. It's either a user from year or from year. In any case, we need to add the provider to the user's providers. So await user.related. The relationship is socials. Just as we have before, we're going to do first or create. The search payload is going to be the provider, which we can get from params.provider. Then the save payload is going to be the provider ID. What this will do is create the social for the user if the particular social doesn't exist already. Otherwise, it will just retrieve it. Then every other thing remains the same. We log in the user and redirect to the dashboard. Let's head over to the browser and test it out. First, I'm going to log in with GitHub. Let's check the database. An account has been created. And if you look at the user socials table, a record has been added with GitHub as the provider and the GitHub ID as the provider ID. And the user ID is linked to the user. Now I'm going to log out and log in with Google. Again, I'm logged in. And if we check the database, you notice there's only one record here. And in the user socials table, we now have two records, one for GitHub and one for Google, both for the same user. So that is how to allow users to authenticate with multiple providers. Another benefit of doing it this way is that you can easily allow users to connect or disconnect OAuth providers in their accounts.